And hello everyone, welcome back to another Flask tutorial. So in this tutorial we'll be taking a look at using a database in Flask. For those of you who don't know, a database is just a little bit of storage you can use to store things. So it's like a structure you can use. You have a table, and in that table you can store the user's username, almost like an Excel sheet. So if we were to go and open up Excel, then it's almost like this, where you have your names, and here you could have your passwords, and here you could have your emails. Very similar to this. And in here you could have Jack, Diane, Nick, and in their passwords. And here you could have their emails, whatnot. It's very similar to this, where everything has like its column and then what goes in it. So once you have like this idea in your head, you know what a database is. It's literally just that, but usually it's encrypted and it's very faster storage than having to actually read an Excel sheet or having to read a file. You'll see in the course that we're going to do that we are not using a database. Using a database would have made a lot of that easier, but I want you to try and add a database afterwards. So I'm not going to use one, but I want you to do it as homework. But we'll get to that when we get to that. Alright, so let's actually get started. Now to use a database inside of Flask, you need to import SQLAlchemy or SQLAlchemy. You import it from SQLAlchemy, which you might need to install with pip. So from Flask SQLAlchemy, you might have to install this with pip, just again. So just pip install Flask SQLAlchemy if you don't have it. Import SQLAlchemy. And this will import SQLAlchemy for you. We can also import datetime from datetime. And you just go import. Cool. Now first we need to say what type of database we're going to be using. You get things like SQLite, PostgreSQL, MySQL. You get a bunch of these SQL different types. In our case, we are going to be using SQLite, primarily because we don't need to install any extra dependencies to use it. It's just going to be a little file. Generally, if you have a real application, SQLite should be used only for testing or for when you get started. But once you publish that application, you should rather use something such as MySQL or PostgreSQL. Or if you don't want to use SQL, you could always go something like MongoDB. But MongoDB does have a somewhat different approach than what we're going to be using. So first we have to go app.config. And we can just specify SQLAlchemy database URI. URI is the same as URL in a sense. Very minor difference, but generally URI is the same as URL. Usually if you're hosting your database on a different server, then you want to put the URL in here. So we go equals and then you put your URL here. Since we are using SQLite, we're just going to be a little file. We don't need to link to it from a different website. We just link it here. So we can say SQLite colon. So we're going to be using SQLite. If you're going to use Postgres or something like that, you should change this. We can just go //. This, I think, means that it's going to be on this computer. So we don't have to go to a different server to get it. We can then say users.db. And this means it's going to be in the users.db file. That's where our SQL is going to be. Or data. We can then say db is equal to SQLAlchemy, and we just pass in app. Now we need to say what the structure of this database is going to look like. So we need to define all of the tables inside of this database. So if you want to, you don't necessarily have to specify users. This is the database name, but this database can have multiple tables, so multiple Excel sheets, if you will. inside of it. So this could maybe just be storage.db or whatever. I'm just calling it users just to keep it simple. So we can go class, and here you give the table name. In this case, we can just say users or user, so singular, because this will also be the structure of one user that's stored in the database. And then just db.model. And in here, you store all of the things you might want, such as how we just had the user's name, their email, and their password in the Excel sheet. You have to put it in here. So let's give it an ID. This ID can be what we can use to uniquely identify this user in the database. So each user will have a unique ID. That is equal to db.column. This is an optional field. You don't necessarily need this. I just usually like it because it is good practice. db, and then we want to make it an integer. An integer is a number. So it's 1, 2, 3. That would be an integer. So this column will hold a number value, an integer. It will also be the primary key, meaning that this will be the key that identifies this user, this specific person in this database, in this table. So basically what we just did, but this specifies to SQL that we wanted. We can then also maybe have their username. So if this user has a username that they want to log in with, that could be db.column. We can say db.string. String is text. It just means it's a piece of text. So anything in double quotes. So this here, this would be a string. And then we can specify how long it should be. So they can only have up until 50 characters for their username. Their username cannot be longer than 50 characters. And we could have email. And this email could be db.column. This could also be a string, and we could say their email is also not longer than 50 characters, but this is optional. So we don't necessarily need to specify how long something should be. And in here we could say nullable is equal to false. Basically, whenever we don't want a field to be empty, because sometimes a user may not enter their details into this field, and then it will be null or none in Python. So null is the same as none in Python. And then lastly, we could do a password and whatnot, but that's not necessary. Lastly, we could do a date created. And this could be like the date this user was created. So when they first signed up. db.column. This could be a date time type, so it's going to store a date and a time. And we can say default, so it will have a default value. If we don't provide a value for it, it will automatically infer this value. Date time dot UTC now. And this will mean its default value would be the UTC time now. Now this is pretty cool. So now that we have this, let's try and create this database. We can later work a little bit with the data inside of it. Now I'm going to start up a Python environment. Let me actually just resize this a little bit. Here we go. I'm going to say in this folder where my project currently is, which is Flask. If I say ls, you'll see we have an admin py, an app py, all of these. So it's in the same folder. It has to be in the same folder. All right, once you have it, you can just say Python, and this will open up a Python environment. So you can write normal Python here. So print hello, and you'll see it prints hello. I'm going to say from main import db. So from this, actually this should be from app, not main. So from app import db. So you'll notice Here we have an app.py. I'm importing this database here. You should be able to import it. If you get an import error, then you might be in the wrong folder or trying to import the wrong file or the wrong variable. In this case, we just get a warning because by default, SQLAlchemy tracks what is happening in our database. This does take a lot of resources, so by default, this will be disabled in the future, but I don't think it matters too much for our scenario. Then all we need to do, and this will generate a database file for us, is we can say db.create all, and this will create all of the files for us. And this might have to be with some brackets. And now you should have a users.db file. If you try and open it, you won't really be able to see what's in it because it's going to be somewhat encrypted. So you can use an SQLite viewer to view it. In my case, I have SQLite, so this DB browser for SQLite. You might have it as SQLite browser, but I have this DB browser for SQLite. There are other ones out there as well. If I open this up, then here we will be able to view our database. We can just say open database, or we might actually be able to just drag and drop, but I don't know. So let's open the database. Mine would be in documents, tuts, Flask, users.db. There we go. Yours should have been generated as well. And we can say open. And now you'll notice we have one table here called users. Right here, users. Or should I rather say, right here, user. Now this user has an ID, a username, an email, and a date created. This is what we have here. So it created the database and the tables for us by using that db create all. If you want to browse the data, you'll notice there's not really anything in here. So we can maybe add a few items here. So you can either execute some normal SQL code. I do have a course on SQL, not the best, but it does give you the basics on SQL. But I am just going to maybe go here and see if I can enter some data without doing that. So here in browse data, I can go here and say insert new record into current table. If you use a different browser, you should have something very similar to this button here, where you can add new data to your table. When I click on that, we are able to do this. So now we have a new field. So here with null, this would be the username. I could say this is Nick. We can say apply, and now their username will be Nick. This email here we could say is nick@gmail.com. We say apply, and in here if date created, it should by default say now. But I believe it's probably because of the way we're inserting data that it is not doing that. But it's not too important. Generally, you will be inserting data from inside of Python. But this is just to give an example. We can then maybe add one. Actually, this should be enough. Or maybe add one more. This could be random name, random email, and then date created we can leave empty. Once you're done with this, you might want to write changes. Sometimes it will save automatically for you. But when you do this, it will write the changes for you. It will save it if it doesn't do it automatically. I have done before where I do things here and I forget to save. Writing the changes are very important. So write changes that will save. Once you have that, you will have data inside of your database. So we refresh here, you'll notice we now have data. Now let us go here and see how this data looks. So I'm not going to send anything to the front end today. That you can probably do on your own without any issues. But when we hit this endpoint, I would like to be able to get the data in our database. So I can say all users is equal to user.query. This means create a query, ask a question. And you could do something such as order by. Order by means ordered by maybe the username or by their age or their email. This is an optional one. I'm not going to order by. But if you want to, it's just order by user dot, and you can order by the ID, the date created, the email if you want to, the username, whatnot. And you can just say all. This will get all of the data from the database. I believe .first is also an option, but for our case, let's just do all. And this will give you a list of users. So if we were to print out all users, then we should be getting a list of either objects or users. So let's go here and let's run our code again. Now when we visit this page, we should now receive some data. So we get user 1 and user 2. That is about what is expected. We can then go here and say print users maybe at index 0. This is a list. You can do all the things with a list with this. So if we say 0, we'll get 1 user. Because this is a list of user, and take note, if you're using Python 3.9 or lower, this type inference may not work. So you might not be able to do this, but this is just optional. It doesn't do anything. It just helps the typing out. But this will just be a list of users. So if we go here, we can say email. So now we can get the user at index 0's email. If we then refresh this page, we go here, we get as dust, just. Alright, so that's pretty neat. So it's very simple to use this to get data from the database. Let's say we want to add data to the database. Well, you can just get data from a form, and then you can say new user is equal to user, and now we can just pass in everything we need. So I know for this user we will need the username. We don't need to specify ID. It's the primary key, and it will most likely figure out on its own what it should be. The username is equal to, let's say, Jack. And the email is equal to jack@gmail.com. And in the date created, we can leave that, but you could add your custom date created. But in this case, it should by default add this UTC now. Now that we have the user, we can say db.session.add, and we want to add the new user to our database. Then we need to save the changes, so write changes. db.session.commit, and this will save all of the changes we've made to the database. If we save this and we refresh this page, now when we go to our SQLite browser and we go to, let's open a recent, browse data, we'll see we now have jack@gmail.com with a date created. So that is how you can add the data through Python. To delete data, let's say we want to delete. Let's delete this guy right here. He's probably a bot. We can then go to here, number 2, that's their ID. And we could try and find that user. So user is equal to user.query.get or 404. So we will get a 404 not found error if the user with ID 2 is not found. Then we can just say db.session.delete, and we can just say user. That will delete this specific user. If we now go refresh, go back here, refresh, user 2 is gone. Notice our IDs did not change. These are primary keys, so they will never, ever, ever, ever change. They will always be going up now. So 2 will forever be gone. This is a great method to make sure you don't get confused with, oh, now this ID has changed, so now the user is kind of different. No more of that. To edit a user, we could go, let's try and edit user 1. So with ID 1. And we can just go user dot, and let's say their email has changed to nick@nick.nick. Now when we refresh the page, their email would have changed. So we go here, refresh, nick@nick.nick. And that's the basics of working with databases in Flask. It's very simple, very easy to use. And generally, I would recommend you use a database whenever you want to store something. Try not to use a file, because working with files is very confusing and very dangerous. But when you use a database, it's super easy and super fast. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. And I'll see you all again in the next Flask tutorial.